Thank you very much, Dr. Pathak and the office bearers of NAS. It's indeed a great honor and privilege to be asked to deliver this oration, which has also been named after my father. And it is always very emotional to be in this location because, of course, we grew up right next door. And it was, of course, the most beloved Karma Bhumi of my father. So for many reasons, it is wonderful to be here and to be speaking with you all, and also strengthening the partnerships between the Academy and MSSRF and other like-minded organizations who are all interested in the future of nutrition security, not just for India, but really for the world as a whole, and particularly the global South. So I chose the topic of One Health because it does cover, it sort of crosses boundaries between many different disciplines, is of interest to all of us. But at the same time, it's also very broad and you can bring practically everything under One Health. So it is a challenge actually to make sure that, but I will stick to my time of 40 minutes. So this is a quotation from my father. He always believed in the power of partnerships and collective. He was not somebody who thought that alone you should go ahead and try to achieve. Of course, he was a leader. We always have leaders, but behind the leader, you have teams. And he said many times that the Green Revolution came about not only because of the technologies, the new high-yielding varieties of wheat and rice and the other inputs which went in along with that, but it was the policy environment, it was the political leadership and support, and most of all, it was the farmers' involvement and the ownership by the farmers of the new technology that can lead to a revolution. So the difference between incremental progress and having a revolution is, in his words, a symphony orchestra has to be created in order to make a sort of a game changer movement up. So the One Health paradigm, you can see that, you can't read everything that's under that umbrella, but it basically covers a whole lot of different things, from the environment to animals, flora, fauna, and of course, including human beings. But it's a very interdisciplinary and a transdisciplinary science, and that often is the challenge because we are not all used to that kind of scientific endeavor. Now, there are many drivers of One Health. You can see on the right-hand side the problems that could be classified as One Health issues. Of course, the one that we all are afraid of and recognize as zoonotic disease emergence, particularly if it leads to outbreaks, epidemics, or pandemics, because we are still very traumatized by COVID. And now that there is a small spike in cases, I'm getting a lot of calls from the media asking about COVID, because still I think the memory of COVID is still very fresh and people are very traumatized by it. So zoonotic disease emergence is certainly something that human beings are concerned about, but it also leads to pathogen distribution is changing. Health disparities are increasing. We have increasing inequality. Food and water safety and security, it in a way impacts poverty as well because of degradation of the land, loss of biodiversity, wildlife habitat. So we see more and more reports of human-animal conflict occurring in different parts of the country, environmental contamination, and often operating with diagnostic limitations. But the drivers really are, the change in land use patterns. Everywhere we see that happening, and agriculture has a lot to do with it in both ways. Agriculture contributes partly to deforestation and land use. By agriculture, I'm also including livestock and things like that. But at the same time, it is also one of the main areas which can actually contribute to reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. Economic development, globalization, energy extraction, greenhouse gas emission, migration are the drivers, and then you have other influences. And if you look at the SDGs which come under One Health, you can see quite a few of them, 1 and 3 relating to human health, and a few more relating to the health of plants, animals, environment. So several of the SDGs are covered under One Health. Now we know that globally, the world is not on track to achieving the SDGs by 2030. In fact, in the last few years, ever since COVID, all the curves, the graphs that were going in a good direction upward, they have all either plateaued or started going down. So unfortunately, many of the health indicators, many of the other indicators are going down. Now India's rank is 109, and this is the score. Niti Aayog, of course, tracks it. But you can see, on the right-hand side that about a third are on track, and about a third are worsening, and the rest are actually in between where there's limited progress. So in terms of zero hunger, we see that it is sort of stagnating. And in some parts of the world, that hunger is increasing. We also talk about the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. These three are mutually reinforcing, and they threaten planetary health. And this is why we need to take a more integrated and systemic approach, because quite often, again, it sits in silos. The climate change people are thinking about mitigation, now started thinking about adaptation. The biodiversity group thinks about biodiversity. Somebody else is thinking about pollution, and these are not connected. And I find that health particularly is not being seen, human health is not being seen as integral to any of these planetary threats. So for example, if you take air pollution, this is something that I am very active in. As was mentioned, I co-chair a commission called Our Common Air along with Prime Minister Helen Clark. And essentially, the data shows that 99% of the world's population is breathing air, which is way above the WHO safe limits, that is 5 micrograms per cubic meter of PM 2.5. Now, any day in Delhi, the best of days, in fact, nowadays, because there is rain, the air quality is relatively much better, but our PM 2.5 is still in the range of about 100. Whereas the WHO says a cutoff of 5, and anything above that is harmful for health. So we can see here that the greenhouse gases like nitric oxide, CO2, methane, etc., being coming from energy, industry, transport, agriculture, cooking and heating is an important source of these gases, particularly in developing countries, including in India, where still in rural areas, women are using biomass for cooking. Then there are wildfires, periodically in different parts of the world. This is also contributing. So all these gases which are being produced are including things like black carbon and a lot of volatile organic compounds, do have massive impact on our health, not just on the respiratory system, but cardiovascular system. And if pregnant women are breathing polluted air, their babies are affected. So they're born with low birth weight and with poor cognitive and lung development. Of course, young children and elderly are at increased risk of pollution. So this is something that I've been trying to advocate along with many others on the fact that it's actually a big health issue. In fact, it's the biggest risk factor for health today. If you see in India, there are 2 risk factors for health. One is air pollution, both indoor and outdoor, and the other is dietary risks. So basically having a non-nutritious diet as defined by the National Institute of Nutrition, less than 50% of people are actually able to afford what is defined as a nutritious diet. So while nobody goes to bed hungry, I think our micronutrient needs and our protein needs are not being met. So if you look at air pollution, it contributes to over 7 to 8 million deaths every year. And in fact, in our region, that is South Asia, it's contributing to about 2 million deaths, directly or indirectly. So it's a huge issue. And of course, as everyone is aware here, agriculture often gets blamed because of the stubble burning. But the fact of the matter is that it contributes a small percentage, and that too during a limited time of the year. But there are other sources like right now, it is transport, it is energy, it is the biomass for fuel, and there is also dust, and construction plays a major role. Now, climate change, of course, I don't have to tell you that over the last century, we've seen a dramatic increase in global temperatures. And in fact, what is interesting is that the continent that's the fastest warming continent is Europe. Even though, we feel the heat here, and we've talked about 2024 being the hottest year on record, and everybody who lives in North India would have experienced the terrible heat waves last year. I think this year is a little bit better, but it's unpredictable. And if you look at the world map, India actually looks a lighter color than Europe, where the heating has been the most prominent. Now, the reasons for that, according to scientists, could be a couple of reasons. One is the air pollution itself is contributing to a reduced warming on the land, because some of it is getting reflected. The light is getting reflected. The other is the soil moisture, the fact that we do have very large tract of agricultural land, and that could be another reason. So the prediction is that as we clean up our pollution, which we have to do for our health, the heating may actually quickly accelerate. And similarly, if there are changes in soil moisture, we know that water is an issue, that the heating could increase. So our subcontinent is very, very vulnerable to a rapid increase in heat in the future. Now, climate change, firstly, exacerbates existing health issues and risks. It brings new risks as well. And it disproportionately affects people who are living in low and middle income countries, the poor, the elderly, the children. So when you see a flood, who gets affected first? The people who are housing on the banks of the river, whether it's a city where they have kacha houses, on the banks of the canals or river, or whether it's on the banks of the Brahmaputra or any other river. Who gets affected when there is a heat wave? It is the people who are living in housing where they are with a tin roof on top, where they have no ventilation, where the indoor temperature is higher by 5 degrees than the outdoor temperature. Who gets affected by air pollution? It's people who are living exposed, the children who are on the streets, who don't have access to air purifiers and so on. So climate change is going to make these inequities even worse. And apart from that, of course, you'll see changes in vector distribution. So today, the Anopheles stephensi mosquito is able to live in places where it could not live before, and it is spreading malaria. The dengue is the fastest expanding infectious disease in the world today. And the mosquito has adapted so well that it can, basically because of urbanization, it is everywhere. Because we're not able to control the water stagnation, and the mosquitoes are able to breed on it. So there are, of course, the vulnerability factors at the bottom. So on the one hand, you do have the climate hazards, like whether it is drought or floods or cyclones or heat. On the other hand, you have the exposure. How exposed are you also depends on where you are at that time. And then there are the vulnerability factors. Many of these are socio-economic, socio-political, or underlying biological and health. If you're already somebody who's got a health condition, then many of these things can make you much more sick. So it's a combination of the hazard, the exposure, and the vulnerability that actually results in a risk to a particular individual. So if Delhi has a heat wave, everybody in Delhi is not equally impacted, right? There are some people who will be much more impacted. So it's important for policymakers to understand that. So again, just a word to say that women are disproportionately affected because of limited access to services, relief efforts, and decision making, and also their primary role in taking care of families and their health. So whether it's a drought, whether it is heat, whether it is a flood, the woman still has to find food for her family. She still has to look after the children and take, ensure that they get their education and so on. So, and we know that, women's control over assets like land and cash is very low compared to men. So this is again an important element, and the aspects of gender, when we are developing climate action plans, adaptation plans, or heat action plan, gender must be considered as an important element when policy is being made, because otherwise these things get overlooked, and we may end up make things worse for women. Now, animal impacts, of course, in many ways. And food, there's, of course, animal food. Now, animal food production is reduced by more than 20% due to various diseases which are impacting animals. And even if those diseases do not transmit to humans, we can still have a big problem because of the reduction in the animal source food. But we also know that 60% of existing human infectious diseases and 75% of new and emerging infections come from animals. That is, they are zoonotic. Similarly, the pathogens which can be used for bioterrorism, again, majority of them are zoonotic. The rate at which new infections are emerging every year has been increasing. I had a graph, okay, we'll come back to that. If you look at the mammals on Earth, human beings comprise about 34% of the normal global biomass of mammals, whereas livestock constitute about 62%. There are many factors why zoonotic spillovers are increasing. It used to be an average of 3 per year, and now to something like 5 per year. This is because we have encroached into natural ecosystems. We are cutting forests. We are going further and further and building because we have population that's expanding and needs place to grow into. Global travel and trade, it's now estimated if an infection starts in one corner of the world, in one village, within 24 to 30 hours, it's going to be around the world. Because of this, we are in such an interconnected world. And that's what happened during COVID. Before you can actually find out that there's a new pathogen, most likely it has already gone to different parts of the world. Exposure to wildlife and to live animal markets. So a lot of parts of the world, particularly Southeast Asia, have live animal markets. In fact, the market in Wuhan, where COVID is supposed to have originated, is a live animal market where many different species of wild and domesticated animals are kept together, and viruses can actually cross from one to the other. And then at one point, they develop a mutation. So genetic modifications in the virus, which allow the human-to-human transmission. So if you look at avian influenza, for example, it infects birds, of course. Now it is infecting cattle. Across the United States, you have massive avian influenza outbreaks in cattle. Cattle is a mammal. So it's a matter of time if that mutation occurs to enable human to... Right now, avian influenza is a one-off event. One individual gets infected, exposure to an animal, that person, of course, high fatality rate, but that person could die or could recover. They cannot transmit to another human being. So that's what happened during SARS-CoV-2. The mutation enabled that coronavirus to go from human to human. Once you get that mutation, then it becomes a human outbreak. Then, of course, migration of birds and animals can spread. And nowadays, if you have more mixing of domestic and wild birds, and then livestock handling and sanitation is also very important. Even tuberculosis is a disease which we don't often think about being zoonotic, but actually it's reverse zoonotic in this case. So research has shown that humans are spreading TB in India to cattle and also to other animals, mammals. There are cases of elephants and so on getting TB in the zoo, but it's quite common in cattle. And I was recently speaking to a veterinary scientist who's been working on bovine tuberculosis, and she wants to now do a trial of BCG vaccine because once a cow gets TB, it's difficult to treat because you have to give so much load of isoniazid. It's almost impossible and very expensive. So farmers would rather leave that cow to die. So it's a slow and painful death for the cow. So we need better diagnostics, but we also need things like BCG, which is a very cheap vaccine. Can it be used to prevent bovine TB? We need to do those trials. So this is what I was talking about, that you have the animal viruses, which have a high host plasticity. They can move between different hosts. At some point, you have an animal to human spillover. And then if the virus is able to amplify through human to human transmission, then there is, of course, potential for global spread. So over the years, we see that, as I was mentioning, the number of viral zoonotic origin diseases has been increasing. And starting with the Spanish flu 100 years ago, HIV is still a pandemic. H1N1 turned out to be not very severe. Then we had in between, of course, things like Nipah and SARS and Ebola, MERS, H7N9. These have had localized outbreaks. They have not become global pandemics. And the difference between COVID and all of these is that these infections make the person extremely sick. So the person who gets this infection, the bottom, gets sick. They cannot move around. They have to be often hospitalized. They may die also. So they don't spread the infection to too many people, and it's very obvious that so-and-so has got, is sick. But with COVID, we found it was asymptomatic transmission was very common. So the moment you have asymptomatic transmission, it becomes very difficult to put in place any kind of control measures. You remember, despite all the precautions, we took Omicron when it came, it infected almost the entire world's population, could not stop it from spreading. It was so infectious. And the only other known pathogen which is as infectious is measles. So Omicron was even more infectious than measles. So I won't dwell on this. We've already talked about this. But the issue is also a huge economic loss and damage. If you look at COVID, it's estimated, trillions of dollars were lost throughout the year. And as you know, that if you read economic papers, many countries have not been able to recover. India has been relatively doing okay in terms of our economic recovery, but in countries in Africa and all, heavily in debt, not able to recover after COVID. So HIV, again, it's billions of dollars. So it's a huge economic impact on the individual and the family, but also on the country's economy. Now, there's also interaction between the intensification of livestock production, zoonosis, and antimicrobial resistance. As I was saying, the more the intensified kind of agriculture or livestock production, there's also a higher pathogen burden, more chances for the infection to spread from animal to animal, more chances that farmers are going to use antibiotics. Once, when I was in the WHO, actually, I was at Codex Alimentarius meeting in FAO, and a senior government official from the US actually was arguing with me because WHO had put out a guideline that antimicrobials, antibiotics should not be used as a growth promoter for livestock, poultry, pigs, etc. And he was arguing. He said, I'm a farmer, pig farmer. I've had pigs. My whole family has been doing this for generations, and we know what we have to do. We have to put antibiotics in the feed. And who are you, WHO, to tell me that, should not do this? I will. So basically, he was taking a position from the country, trying to argue with us that our guidelines were wrong. So this also keeps happening in WHO, because every guideline we put out, there is somebody who gets upset and wants to change it. But the point is that antibiotics are so widely used, and we are planning to do a survey now. I don't know if ICAR has any data on this. I'm sure there is data on what is the awareness among farmers, among people who do aquaculture or poultry and so on. I'm talking about small farmers, not big industry, on the use of antibiotics as growth promoters, not to treat an infection, but just put it in the feed. And that is what creates antimicrobial resistance. So One Health has been actually talked about now for a few decades because of this increasing zoonotic diseases, and especially after the avian flu and SARS outbreaks. So WHO, FAO, the Organization of Animal Health, and UNEP, they have come together. So they're called a quadripartite, and they have a plan of action now. And there's a framework, and what are the goals that they have to meet and so on. And it's basically rooted in the understanding that human, animal, and ecosystem health are interconnected. So if you take the example of Nipah virus, with which we are very familiar, because in Kerala, we have had these repeated outbreaks. In fact, now the Kerala government is very good. Within one case comes and they're able to stop the outbreak. They very pick it up easily. They diagnose it, they isolate, they put the public health measures, they prevent the outbreak. Now, in India and Bangladesh, it spreads from the raw date palm sap. But in Malaysia, it is contaminated fruit eaten by the pigs, and then from pig to human. And in the Philippines, it's horse to human. Now, how will you know all this unless you do the epidemiological investigations in each country? To actually, it's like almost solving a mystery thriller, that where did this infection start? How did it spread? So the COVID question is still an open question because we have not been able to exactly pinpoint that from the bat. We know that coronaviruses are in bats, but from the bat, how did it arrive in the human? Which was that intermediate animal or host through which it came? Now, this has not been solved because the Chinese government has basically not cooperated with the investigations. So why is it important now in this particular juncture? It's because of all the things we talked about, the climate change, which is already bringing new diseases, urban growth, interconnected world, global travel, antibiotic misuse in farming, deforestation, and the human-animal contact, which can increase the spread of new viruses. And these are, again, just, I think I've already mentioned why it's important, because most of the infectious diseases which are going to affect humans are going to come from animals. Air pollution is a big threat to us, and environmental degradation has been shown through modeling to be responsible for 23% of global deaths. But even more than deaths, I can tell you that environmental degradation is very bad for mental health as well. And there is now enough evidence to show that people who are closer to green environments, maybe a park, maybe you have a lot of trees outside your house, or you have a common area where you can go and spend time, open area, those people's mental and physical health is much better than those people who live in cramped urban environments with no possibility of any kind of outdoor relaxation. So Delhi is one of those few cities, at least the New Delhi part, where there are parks in every colony. If you see, there is a park, and I think those people who planned it knew that this was important. Today's urban cities don't have that, and so there have been studies to show that heart attacks, high blood pressure, everything is higher when you live in places without any greenery and without any open spaces. Leptospirosis is another example of a disease increasing year by year, particularly in urban areas, and we know it's through contaminated urine. So water getting contaminated with the urine of rats, dogs, cattle, and so on, and people get infected by walking through stagnant water or working in flooded fields. Similarly, this Guillain-Barré syndrome, a few months ago, you might remember these cases being reported in Pune, 11 deaths, and for many weeks, we didn't know what was happening. Guillain-Barré syndrome is a neurological syndrome. It can be caused by a few viruses and pathogens and so on. That's a clinical diagnosis, but it can be linked to Campylobacter jejuni infection. And so the moment you have 2 or 3 or 4 cases coming together as a cluster, the next step should be immediately to look at the water sources and see if there's Campylobacter in the water or norovirus. This took weeks, for the authorities to investigate, and meanwhile, 11 deaths happened, and it had spread to neighboring states. So it appears that there is need not only for epidemiological training and an epidemiologist to be placed in every district, but also you need an interdepartmental team. And ultimately, the water was tested and found to be contaminated. So this could have actually been done well in time. Now, antimicrobial resistance, I think you're all very much aware of this. And unfortunately, again, during COVID, there was a massive increase in the use of antibiotics, particularly in India, where everyone was taking, here, of course, nobody even waits for a prescription. You go, you buy the drug from the pharmacy and, consume it. People were taking steroids, people were taking antibiotics. So AMR has gone up. Now, AMR today accounts for about 5 million deaths annually, and this number is going to increase. What's the drivers? Overuse and misuse in humans, animals, and agriculture, all the three. Environmental link, if antibiotics are in waste and water, they spread these resistant genes. And as we know, genes can jump from one bacteria to another. So if you can have either through plasmids or otherwise, you can have these antibiotic resistant genes. Many years ago, the NDMA1 gene, New Delhi metalloproteinase gene, was described. There was a big hue and cry saying, why is it called New Delhi? Okay, maybe you shouldn't name it after a place, but the fact is that it was actually discovered here. And if you look at the modeling currently, you can see India is in orange. By 2050, it's estimated that we will have, and now right now Africa is in the red, but by 2050, it looks as though we would be leading actually in deaths attributable to antimicrobial resistance. And these are the this is the burden, the number of deaths. This was in 2019 that had something to do with antimicrobial resistance, either as an underlying cause or directly associated with microbial resistance. So it's not something to be taken casually. It's like going back to the pre-antibiotic era when there were no antibiotics. So before 1940s, if you got an infection, it is up to nature. You either survived or you died. Now we may be back into a future like that if we don't take care. And we have studies in India showing antibiotic residues in honey, in meat, in milk, but also in rivers and in water bodies, particularly those around factories that are making antibiotics and so on. So the environmental guidelines are not very well followed. We have hospitals, clinics, factories, everybody's discharging the antibiotic into the sewage, and from there it goes. So we need a environmental health is a whole area that we need, I think, much more stronger work. Just for newborns alone, antimicrobial resistance in India results in about 58,000 deaths. About 1 million children, Indian children, die in the first 4 weeks of life. That's called neonatal deaths. And out of that, 58,000 are because of resistance. That means that no antibiotic is working for the infection. Similarly, safe food is also very much linked to this One Health concept, as we all know that contaminated vegetables or meat can transmit pathogens. It could be poor hygiene during farming, during transport, or during cooking. Unregulated use of pesticides and chemicals also affects long-term health. Now here, I think the evidence on this is there, but whether it is really having and what kind of impact it's having, particularly on the hormonal and metabolic profile, as well as on the cancer incidence, I think this is something that we need more work on. We do have now a One Health mission. A national One Health mission was launched, I think, last year, led by the Office of the PSA. And all these departments are involved, including research bodies like ICMR, ICAR, and so on. It's a government-wide effort, and the whole idea is really that they should work together. And there's a National One Health Institute that's coming up in Nagpur in a very nice new model where different ministries are actually contributing to the institute, and there'll be scientists from all sectors working in one place, and hopefully the sharing of data, all those things will also become much more easier. Now, there are 4 goals of this mission. Pandemic preparedness is, of course, one. Both existing infections as well as preparing for new infections. And I was part of a committee that wrote a report for Niti Aayog last year on how India should prepare for pandemics. It includes even going back to a new law, a new regulation and a law, because we are still governed by the Epidemic Diseases Act of 1897. So we need a much more updated law to deal with public health emergencies like pandemics. Implementing integrated disease surveillance, I think this is a challenge. How do you bring animal data, environmental data, and human surveillance data together so that one can start doing correlations? And I think there have been some attempts now. Some pilots are being set up, including at on the periphery of wildlife reserves and so on. A federated data system is needed. I don't know what is happening there, but apne aap se something is. So, and then developing robust disease investigation mechanisms. As I was saying earlier, if you have an outbreak, you need to get to the bottom of that outbreak. Where is it coming from? How is it started? Is it spreading? And then, of course, the control mechanisms. So for pandemic preparedness, these are some of the things that one needs to do. R&D capabilities is very important. Now in India, we have very good R&D capacities for vaccines, whether it's human vaccines or animal vaccines. Now for certain diseases, it's better to more cost effective to vaccinate animals. And for others, it'll be more cost effective to vaccinate humans. And to develop rabies is a good example where the intervention needs to be in dogs not in humans. And still we have significant number of rabies deaths in the country. So we do still have diseases which are old diseases, not new ones, which are still posing a challenge. Plus we have a lot of new ones as well. And then we need this kind of disease investigation, so surveillance units, the outbreak response teams at the state level, at the district level, and then of course at the national level. Now Kerala has done something. So they started in 22, the One Health program. And these departments came together, animal husbandry, health, agriculture, forest, environment. They put a special focus on high-risk diseases like Nipah because they have suffered from that, leptospirosis, dengue. And the important thing there, of course, is that panchayats were involved because in Kerala, the panchayats are very strong, local bodies are very strong. And they realize that they are a high-risk state because very densely populated, a lot of forest cover also, wildlife presence, a lot of climate hazards are coming. They are having repeated zoonotic disease outbreaks and repeated flooding also. So One Health, they felt, would help them to coordinate across different departments to prevent future outbreaks and also protect the health of humans and animals. So what they've been able to do in the last couple of years, already you can see some results like faster detection and control of outbreaks, improved coordination and data sharing, better surveillance systems, increased community awareness, that's very important. And they've also launched a One Health Center for Nipah research in Kozhikode, and they set a model for other states. Now here communities have also been involved and trained because ultimately these everything happens in communities. Somebody is the first person to get that disease. Others around them can notice something unusual happening. A lot of bats are dying, or a lot of chicken are dying, or a lot of crows are dying. They should be able to report it to somebody. Then, of course, we need a lot of health literacy about cleanliness, sanitation, waste management and segregation. That's one of the big challenges I feel, the waste management in our cities, antibiotics being misused and so on, and not spreading rumors. I think this is also important, even though misinformation and disinformation is as dangerous as actually having an outbreak. If you remember a few months ago, there was HMPV virus was reported by somebody. It's a very normal respiratory virus which causes, so everybody, all doctors know that HMPV is a respiratory. But what happened, the media actually created a lot of panic around that, saying a new virus has come, it's come from China and so on. A huge panic happened for 2-3 days before, the public health authorities actually could make people aware that this is not new, it is not dangerous, it has not come from China. So disinformation today can do a lot of harm. So let me quickly just mention a few of our own initiatives. We have recently started this eco-skilling program for tribal youth in our center in Wayanad, where we are training them to be conservation stewards for the biodiversity conservation. And it's a 6-month certificate course. The certificate will be provided by the Transdisciplinary University. And it's a very hands-on and practical. These are, Pania is a very downtrodden tribal group over there. And these kids did not see much hope for their future. They are mostly class 10, 11, 12 pass kids. And now they finished their this is the first batch of 6 months. And we also tied up with other places like Auroville and the Malabar Botanical Garden and so on. So now hopefully they should get jobs, and we are hoping that we can make this into a regular program. Integrated agroforestry. So, Dr. Oliver King is here with me. So we have been working in many tribal areas across Tamil Nadu, Orissa, Puducherry, Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, and helping farmers, to do this kind of on small plots of land. How do you actually maximize, the output? And agroforestry, along with pond fisheries and some poultry or livestock, is a good way of doing that. But you also need off-farm and non-farm small-scale enterprises. Similarly, on greening of hillocks, our virtual knowledge centers and our village knowledge centers and village resource centers. These were established even in the days before there was any mobile or internet connectivity, using video conferencing with satellite in collaboration with ISRO. And many of these champion women farmers and men were actually inducted as virtual knowledge fellows into this academy. Then there's a lot of digital outreach, which we've had a fair amount of experience with in helping farmers to diagnose pests and pathogens, because this actually reduces the application of pesticides, and therefore it actually improves the safety of particularly for vegetables. So we're now trying to move this into more of an AI-based advisory, but even the standard non-AI based services has been proven to be extremely helpful. We use WhatsApp, audio, video, phone in, all, and offline as well as online learning, all together. This has had a very good impact, and we're hoping the Tamil Nadu government will now scale it across the state. Another area of work has been these traditional modes of cultivation, like the Pokali rice, which is a traditional salt-tolerant rice variety, where the farmers do a very unique rice strip rotational farming, and it is naturally organic. It also has a GI tag. Now, the cultivation has been declining for many reasons, and one of them was seed scarcity. So there, we're trying to intervene, working with the farmers there, and really trying to enhance the seed multiplication. We have been traditionally working, developing community seed banks, but this is a risk. Actually, I was recently in Arunachal Pradesh, and they also have a very traditional way of cultivation. The Apatani tribe there in the Zero Valley, they cultivate rice along with fish in that plateau. It's a very small area of land, but so beautifully managed natural resources. And in the buns between the rice fields, they have millets. So they get millets, they get rice, they get fish, and they have so much of greens around them in the forest that they have a very balanced meal. But the principal chief conservator of forests told me that the biggest risk today is the rapidly vanishing agrobiodiversity of Arunachal Pradesh. And he said, if you come back next year, madam, you will find that few more of these land races have disappeared. So basically, he was saying, if you want to do anything here, first thing is to focus on particularly on a huge variety of not just rice and millets, beans, legumes, and these green leafy vegetables, wild foods. And if you go to a place like Wayanad in Kerala, the tubers, the variety of tubers there, it is mind-boggling to see how some of the farmers have conserved. And they've also won the Genome Savior Awards and things like that. So we are working with some farms there to produce these quality Pokali seeds and so on. But also for fisheries, we have had very good success with a fisher-friendly mobile application, which started with a couple of features, and today it has something like 25 features. All has been built with the input of the fishermen. Every year, there is an input given by the fishermen on what would be useful. And today, about 1.2 lakh fishermen are using it. It's available in all the 8 languages of the coastal districts. It uses data from Incois, and it was done with support of Qualcomm. And it tells the fishermen not only about the weather conditions and where they have find fish, but also about many other things, including the maritime boundaries, where the turtle nesting sites are so that they don't approach, and also connecting them to markets. Now, fisher women were traditionally very neglected. And so recently we've had a program called Fisher Women Connect, where we're really training them. About 2,500 fisher women have been given these either smartphones or tablets and trained, so that for the post-harvest fisheries, we can try to reduce the drudgery and also get their incomes to be better. So we're using solar dryers now, so they're drying, packaging, and selling the fish at a much higher cost. And they also don't lose so much of fish because of it getting spoiled. Similarly, in agriculture, we have this Pannai app, which is a pest and disease advance notification and need-based agricultural information. So all these things, when we have heat advisories, we put out the advisory not just for how humans can be safe, how can they keep their livestock safe, how can they keep their poultry safe, what are the steps they need to do to protect their animals, because for farmers, animals are as important as themselves. So, of course, one of the things that my professor always talked about was how do you blend the best of new technologies with traditional knowledge and wisdom. And that is what he called eco-technology. The term that he coined was eco-technology. And so that's what, we've been trying to do. Now, just finally, I'd like to end by saying that, One Health is something everyone would need to be involved. And it's, I think, really important that panchayats and local bodies, municipalities, their awareness has to be created. And because they need to understand, what are these diseases? How do they spread? Why sanitation, waste disposal, clean drinking water is important. Animal vaccination drives, managing stray animal populations, communicating health risks to the people in simple local language. Um, Community involvement. Again, how do you get people so aware that they'll be the first one to notice something unusual and report it? Use trusted voices. So villagers, even during COVID, we saw that government was using trusted people in the locality, whether they were, teachers or youth groups, or maybe sometimes even religious leaders who were trusted. They were actually used to provide the information. And folk performances, community radio, sometimes these things are more effective than pamphlets or giving lectures. And similarly, misconceptions need to be corrected, especially like around vaccine safety or around antibiotics. When do you need to use antibiotics and so on? Youth, I think youth and students, they really are the ones who are much more aware. And yet we need more, because many students don't get the opportunity to listen to these things. So we have a program called Every Child a Scientist, where we bring them in for 2 weeks to the foundation, and they can engage with a scientist, number of different activities, projects, work in the lab. And we should integrate One Health themes into science and social studies and environmental subjects. I think farming communities, I don't know how much really has been done to prevent the use of antibiotics, especially as growth promoters or as prevention. But also biosafety and hygiene obviously is important. Safe disposal of animal waste and clean water sources. So ultimately it comes, to the fact that One Health is really has to be everyone's responsibility, but then it also becomes a challenge, because once you say it's everybody's responsibility, then sometimes it translates into it's nobody's responsibility. So I think we as scientists need to make sure that we are very clear about what needs to be done, and also work together across the different agencies. And I believe that NAS and the other science academies are in a very good position to take this forward, because now there is a national program and a plan, but it's still needs a lot of work on the ground. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for this opportunity, and I will stop.